So I'm honored to be here with Rabbi Dr. Or Rose, who is the founding director of the Center for Global Judaism at Hebrew College. He's very well known not only as a writer, as a social activist, as a teacher, as a builder of Hebrew College, but also as a scholar of many fields, but in particular Chassidut. And I'd love to just chat with you a little bit about that tonight. To start with, what do you think is the unique pedagogy that Chassidut has to contribute to Jewish thought and beyond?
First, thank you for the opportunity to be in dialogue with you. In responding to the question, I think of a story that Chassidim often tell about the experience of the Baal Shem Tov, the spiritual founder of the movement, meeting the Maggid of Mezrich, in some ways his successor, for the first time. And in their exchange, what we learn is that the Maggid becomes a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov through the Baal Shem Tov's use of story. And I think that teaches us an important lesson about some of the pedagogic contributions of Hasidism to Jewish life and thought. I think that the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid, and those that followed them understood deeply that people learn and experience the sacred in different ways. And therefore, storytelling, song, dance, all became very important in the development of this spiritual revival movement. There were different modes through which people could taste and touch and feel divinity.
Mm-hmm. So once we're talking about multiple intelligences, how do we even build educational programs around that? Once you have such eclectic interests and diverse minds, is it still possible to have sort of an educational program for diverse students? What does it look like even?
Right. So that's a big question, which takes us to fields beyond this one, of course. Yeah. But let me just say one brief thing in response to you, which is I think that we have to be sensitive as educators to the different ways in which our students learn and grow. And I think in any context, it's easy to become habituated and to say, this is the way, or these are the limited ways in which we function.
Right.
And I think to come back to Chassidut, more specifically, part of what was exciting to so many people within the Jewish world is that the Baal Shem Tov and his students created a movement in which there was certainly a place for the pursuit of the intellectual, but it was also married to other modes of knowing and being in the service of God as they understood it.
Yeah. Some of the pachad, some of the fear that I feel as a Jewish educator is around how many am I holding back from their growth by not tapping into the correct mode that works for them?
Right.
And the challenge, and I think feeling some sense of awe around that complexity of the human experience. And that's fascinating that Chassidut really opens up that consciousness of the human, of the inner world. So around the issue of theology, what do you think Chassidut does to add or expand or to contribute to Jewish theology at large?
One phrase that comes to mind immediately is a statement that Abraham Joshua Heschel made. Heschel, of course, was the amical, the offspring of several generations of Chassidic masters, and he said, in question form, why is it that the Baal Shem Tov is remembered as a legend in the Jewish world? What was it about the Baal Shem Tov that captured people's imaginations? His answer was that while other people spoke about God, the Baal Shem Tov brought God to the people. And I think that's the beginning of an answer in terms of Hasidism's contribution theologically, which is to say the emphasis on God's immanence. In particular, the possibility of experiencing divinity within the mundane. And they are not alone in saying that, but there was a strong emphasis on tasting and touching and feeling the sacred in nature, in common conversation, in one's business dealings. There are countless stories, of course, within the Chassidic tradition about the unexpected people and times and places which become sources of holiness for those that didn't expect it. And part of that, to use specific Chassidic language, is this notion of avodah b'gashmiut, service through the embodied. Let us translate it for the moment, which is to say, just as we can experience divinity in Torah study or in prayer, we can also experience the sacred while in nature or while in conversation. And I think that kind of spiritual consciousness is part of what made Hasidism so attractive to so many people. And for me personally, it's something that remains quite compelling. Heschel also used the expression radical amazement, that we wake up every day and experience the beauty and the grandeur and the mystery of life. And to understand that as part and parcel of the religious journey is something that I think remains compelling to many people.
So here we're talking about the outer world and our relationship to it in many ways. Talk to me about the inner world.
Sure.
What is the primary contribution Chassidut does make or can make to human psychology?
Right. So scholars of Hasidism have pointed out that, in fact, theologically, much of Hasidic thought flows from earlier Kabbalistic and philosophical sources, but that there is a distinctive turn when it comes to its understanding of the interior life of the human being, which is to say, there's far less speculation in Hasidism about the cosmos than in classical Kabbalah. Much more of that energy is focused on the human spirit, the interior landscape. So one expression, for example, that I think is very powerful is the Chassidic notion of birur, of what we would call in English discernment. That life is about sifting and sorting and clarifying, and that our actions have to be infused with a certain kind of consciousness, awareness, intentionality, so that the movement is very much kavanah centered. It takes place classically within the traditional world of halakha, but a great emphasis is placed on where are you? You know, that expression of ayeka from the book of Genesis, from Bereshit, I think is one that rings in the ears of the Hasidic masters. So what is your intention as you prepare to pray? What is your intention as you are sitting to study? One of the famous stories about a disciple that goes to the Maggid of Mezrich is that when he returns, the father of this person asks him, so what did you learn from this great master, with some cynicism in his voice? Was it Torah? You know, was it Talmud? What was it that you learned? And the disciple says, I learned how to tie my shoelaces, right, from observing the Maggid. So there's a certain kind of mindfulness, right, which this movement tries to develop and hone. And that's understood as at the heart of the religious quest. The other thing that I will say in invoking the name of another great master from Chassidut, that of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who was the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, is that I think Rabbi Nachman in particular has been an important teacher for many people within and beyond the world of traditional Hasidism when it comes to dealing with pain and suffering. Because the Baal Shem Tov, as I alluded to a few moments ago, stresses the possible joys of life in simply observing the wonders of creation. And then along comes his great-grandson and says, I am searching, I'm questing, I'm trying, but I also experience the shadow side of life. And in his teaching and his striving to try and integrate those more difficult pieces of life, I think he's become an important teacher for many other people who are sometimes stumbling, who are groping, who are searching. One way in which he talks about that process very powerfully is to try and bring your sadness or sorrow into the dance of life, so that you don't ignore it or you don't suppress it, but you ask yourself, are there ways somehow to uplift it and to learn and to grow from it?
Yeah. That last point in particular, I think in my own spiritual practice, I was hitting walls with trying to remove, destroy, suppress emotions as opposed to channeling
Right.
negativity and allowing it to breathe in a sense. I think Rabbi Nachman was influential in that. So I think my last question for you is around the translation from the pre-modern to the modern, or even from the modern to the postmodern, that we're no longer in Ukraine or Poland or Lithuania or earlier Kabbalistic roots in Sfat or wherever. And I think our relationship to Gentiles, to women, to secular knowledge, to the whole human experience in many ways has shifted. Not only the Jewish discourse, but the broader contemporary landscape. I wonder, how do we translate Chassidut today in a way that keeps its authenticity and yet allows its full relevancy and meaning to flourish today?
I think it's a very important question. And in some ways, I think it's actually reflective of the whole Chassidic project, because its founders saw themselves as being involved in a process of spiritual renewal. And it's no accident that, for example, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who created the Jewish renewal movement in the United States, was heavily influenced by Chabad Hasidism in particular, but Hasidism writ large. So I think that's a part of the good news of the story, which is there is a model, even if the particulars may be quite different. And I think translation is a very good way to speak about what we might need to do, because I think there are specific terms, symbols, and underlying assumptions that carry both light and shadow. Again, to use a Chassidic expression, one way to think about it is that there are nitzotzot. There are sparks of light, but there are also husks. And I say that as someone that loves this tradition, but also aware that in every generation we have the responsibility to try and sift and sort and clarify what it is that God is calling us to do and to be. So you touched on some of those questions. I don't have simple answers, but what I do know is that if the message of Chassidut is about the discovery of the sacred in the seemingly mundane, then it certainly is not limited to the experience of interacting with Jews. And it certainly also requires us to think about the roles of men and women in terms of leadership, because we know there are a long list of great Rebbeim, but classically those were all men. So how do we properly adjust and take from some of those beautiful teachings, at the same time respect the traditions of the past by asking good and difficult questions? I think it would be disloyal in some ways to the Baal Shem Tov or to the Maggid of Mezrich not to ask difficult questions about how to find divinity and how to bring light to our world, unless it involves our own renewal. I'll end with a teaching from Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, and Levi Yitzchak has an interesting teaching about the Mishkan, about the tabernacle, and about the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. And he says that there's a medieval discussion about to what extent the two were different or the same. And his answer is they were the same in that they were different. And then he goes on to say, in every generation, we are to understand that yes, we are rooted in the past, but there's also a need for chidush, for spiritual creativity. And we don't ignore the voices of the past. There's too much to learn from them. And yet we understand that these great souls were also searching and questioning. And because they were human, they also made mistakes. And we need to learn from that. Again, one of my own teachers, Reb Zalman, passed away just 2 years ago, used the expression living on the growing edge of Judaism. He said, I don't want to live on the cutting edge. Because if you live on the cutting edge, then you're cutting yourself off from so much that is rich and beautiful. But there has to be a process of honest self-assessment, collective assessment, and listening deeply to what God is calling us to here and now.
Well, I've really admired you for a long time. Not only your interfaith work, your social justice work, but also your ability to engage all around you in growing their sophistication of spirituality, of theology, of Chassidut. And I think so much to offer. I hope you'll check out Rabbi Dr. Or Rose's writings online and continue to learn from him as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.